Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian. As you can see, I'm currently on a camping trip. I'm driving down to San Francisco and camping along the way. And in today's short video, I would like to talk about how power works, which is to say, I would like to talk about the signifier of the master, as well as provide you with a brief introduction to what Lacan calls the four discourses, as well as the concept of subjective destitution. All that and more coming up in the next 10 minutes or so. But first, a big thank you to everybody watching today, and a special thank you to the patrons who allow me to keep making these YouTube videos each and every day. Thank you so much. So I want to begin by talking about how power works, at least according to Lacanian psychoanalysis. There's actually an example that I came across a while back in one of Obama's biographies, in which he says that as president, when decisions were brought to his table, they were by definition impossible decisions. Which is to say, to be in the Oval Office is to assume a position of authority by which at a certain point you take in all of the expertise from the different points of view, and there is no good answer. And yet, nevertheless, the person with authority is the one who assumes the role of the master, who makes the decision, who makes the tough call. And this is something that was actually articulated first by Churchill in his writings about World War II, where Churchill said that at a certain point, you've heard the expert opinion of every person on what ought to be done. And at that point, it's up to the person in charge to take the leap, which is in a sense a leap of faith. There is no good answer. Therefore, the way in which power works is that one person has to assume the symbolic stance of the master, thereby assuming the responsibility, as it were, as to that impossible decision. And this is quite important within Lacanian psychoanalysis, this idea of a symbolic figurehead, of a master signifier who retroactively gives meaning to the truth and knowledge production processes around it. In fact, this is what Lacan calls the four discourses. And what's important to note about the four discourses is that it's really one discourse with three addenda, which is to say, it's not that we have four equal discourses, it's that we have the discourse of the master signifier, around which are structured the following three discourses, namely university discourse, the production of knowledge; the hysterical discourse, the question, what am I to the other, to the master; and finally, the discourse of the analyst, which is also the discourse of subjective destitution. And so what I'd like to do now is to give you a brief explanation with some examples of how each of these works and how they can help us understand how power works. So let's begin with the university discourse. What's important about university discourse and the production of knowledge is that the agent of said discourse, usually the academic or the professor, the expert, assumes a supposedly objective authority, which is to say, the expert always says, it's not just my personal opinion, I am speaking on behalf of scientific or objective truth. Or if it's within the humanities, it's I am speaking on behalf of the literature and the tradition. Which is to say that there is a slightly perverted stance to the university discourse, which is that it assumes or embodies a theatrical stance of being objective, of being simply the voice of a higher form of truth, and yet nevertheless hiding behind this, pretending not to be an authority and therein precisely remaining one. This is why the university discourse can only ever be a supplement to the discourse of the master. After all, the master is the one who has to embody the position of pure will, who has to make the decision. A master can never say, I did this because I am speaking for scientific truth. He has to assume the gaps of that which cannot be known. He can listen to the expert, but he cannot simply follow the expert's advice. So university discourse, therefore, is the production of knowledge, which is a truth process which occurs around and so as to sustain the symbolic horizon of the master, to fill it in with objective, verifiable, empirical knowledge. Secondly, we have the discourse of the hysteric. And it's important to note here that the central hysterical stance is to say, what am I to the other? And the hysteric, therefore, always looks towards a master, someone who is supposed to tell him who he is for that other. In fact, from a Lacanian Žižekian position, to be a subject is to be inherently hysterical, to ask yourself the question, who am I, and what does it mean to be alive, and what would I like to do with my life? These are essentially hysterical questions. They have to be filled in, and our demand is that we look towards the other, towards the master, to fill them in for us. This can be a figure of parental authority, this can be a strongman leader, this can be simply going online and taking part in a personality quiz or a piece of paper that tells you what type of job aptitude you have. Here we have the hysterical subjective stance that is trying to find its own identity, reflected back to it by the master. What's important to note here is that there is a dialectical interrelationship, if you will, between the university discourse and the discourse of the hysteric. For example, let's say that you go online because you have a headache and you diagnose yourself with terminal brain cancer. Here we have the hysterical stance. What am I? What is happening to me? How am I suffering? And you look for an explanation online, and you find it in the supposed authority of whatever medical or pseudo-medical website you have. Therefore, this is not so much the production of truth as it is the production of a kind of necessity for the subject to identify or diagnose himself. We look towards a figure of authority who can tell us what is wrong with us. Finally, we have the discourse of the analyst, which Lacan characterizes as the most perverted stance, or, if you will, the stance of subjective destitution. So why does Lacan argue that the discourse of the analyst is perverted? Well, in order to understand that, it helps to know what Lacan actually means by perversion. For Lacan, perversion is, if you will, the opposite of hysteria. Remember, the hysteric wants to know who he is and asks the other to tell them, what am I to you? Like the patient going to the doctor saying, what is my symptom for you? How can you read it and interpret it? Whereas the pervert is the one who assumes the agent, if you will, of the other's enjoyment. The pervert is the one who isn't preoccupied with who am I or what am I to you, but who simply is, who simply becomes an agent of the other's desire. Therefore, for Lacan, the psychoanalytic analyst is the ultimate pervert. Why? Well, in a therapy session, the psychoanalyst simply sits there and is the subject to the hysterical subject, namely the one who has no stake in the game, who is simply there to be talked at and to give the subject some form of satisfaction, not an answer, because the psychoanalytic therapist is not a master in this sense, but precisely to refuse an answer, to simply become the vanishing mediator, if you will, for the subject's hysterical discourse. Thereby, the subject can reveal his own truth, can understand and become a master of his own subjectivity. Hence why for Lacan, hysteria is actually constitutive to this process of analysis. It's just that there has to be a scene, a space in which the analyst assumes the figure of empty authority, who simply is but does not offer the truth, so that the subject himself can articulate this stance. Now, so Lacan deems this position of the analyst subjective destitution, and subjective destitution, which I can cover in another video, is essentially how the analyst makes himself empty, makes himself an empty master, so that the subject can find his own position of truth. Once again, what's important to note here is that this is a question about power. Lacan's basic understanding of power is that we have a master signifier, which is essentially empty. It's, if you will, a materialization of the big other. It's a symbolic authority that is assumed by pure will, namely not by means of legitimacy or university discourse, but it is simply something that exists that guarantees meaning and signification in the world, whether it's a monarch or a president. Therefore, in a sense, the monarch or the president, the person of authority, doesn't have to legitimize their authority. They simply have to assume their position of power by means of their will. And one of Žižek's arguments about this, his polemic, his politicization of the Lacanian argument of the four discourses, is that within a contemporary world, power no longer has, if you will, the guts to assume this stance. Your boss, who pretends to be your friend, thereby takes on a perverse enjoyment of knowing that he is nevertheless the person who could fire you. He does not assume his full authority. The parent, who pretends to be their child's best friend, is thereby once again a empty master figure who doesn't assume his full authority. The experts who claim to speak not on behalf of politics but on behalf of empirical truth are afraid to assume the proper gap of symbolic authority. And Žižek's argument is that this fear, this reluctance to assume the symbolic emptiness of authority as pure will leads to a return of the repressed, what Žižek calls a return of obscene masters. And, no surprise, for Žižek, Donald Trump is the obscene master. The master who says, I don't listen to truth or reason or to politics. I simply embody power as my own pure will, an agent of pure will. And Žižek's argument, therefore, is that Trump is an obscene master, a return of the repressed, namely a return of the obscene kernel within the master signifier as such. That is how power works, according to the Lacanian four discourses. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope that you have enjoyed the natural surroundings and the bird song. It's very early in the morning, and I will see you tomorrow. Oh, and please do consider becoming a patron if you would like to download my ebooks and all of my lectures. See you soon.